This video is going to show you the various ways in which Robben Ford uses the diminished scale to create tension within a 12-bar blues. Now this can often seem like a very complicated subject, and hearing things like octatonic and symmetrical scales for the first time can induce nightmares in the uninitiated. We're going to build this into something we all know and love really well, namely the pentatonic and blues scales. We'll also look at how Robben approaches a blues from a chordal perspective, because if you understand the harmony, then ultimately this is going to give you that joyous sense of freedom where the guitar neck becomes our playground when improvising. So if you feel like you're stuck in pentatonic purgatory, stick around, because delving into these outside sounds can help open doors for developing your own voice. My name's Steve Allsworth, let's dive in. I've been a massive Robben Ford fan for as long as I can remember. He's got an insanely good ear and an amazing sense of rhythm and phrasing. Now, although he's primarily a blues player, he often strays onto the jazzy side of the street, which is what I love. Now, I first became aware of the diminished sound in his Blues and Beyond book and video release way back in 1992. Now, this really opened my ears and eyes to the possibilities that lay beyond the humble pentatonic. Now, I thought I'd got a really good handle on the blues from listening to greats such as B.B. King, Albert King, Stevie Ray Vaughan, you name it. Now, I must stress that I absolutely love these players, but Robben had this extra level of harmonic sophistication that added to the standard pentatonic vocabulary. So we'll be focusing on using the diminished scale in some key areas of the 12-bar blues sequence, and this can create some of those real head-turning moments. So before we jump headlong into the scales and licks, it's a really good idea to develop some understanding of how diminished seventh chords function within a blues. I'm going to play a slow blues in A using some typical Robben Ford voicings, and I want you to really focus on where we hear the tension and release. So as you can see, there are three main points in a 12-bar blues sequence where we tend to have diminished seventh chords. And they're there to add to that sense of anticipation and tension as we're travelling to the next chord in the sequence. Now the first is when we're moving from the one chord in the key of A, that'll be A7, to our D7, that's the 4 chord. And in between there, our bridging chord, our diminished seventh chord, is simply there to add to that sense of tension and then resolve really nicely when we go to the 4 chord. Now, dominant seventh chords lend themselves really well to outside sounds, largely because we've got a major triad and a diminished triad on top of one another. So there's already quite a bit of tension inside of this chord, but we can add more by fully extending this diminished triad by going up another minor third to the B flat there at the 6th fret. Another, perhaps more practical way of looking at this is thinking of an A7 arpeggio. So we've got root, 3rd, 5th, and flat 7. But instead of playing the root, we replace that a semitone above with our B flat. And we've created a diminished 7th arpeggio. Now either way you look at it, what we're doing there is superimposing a diminished 7th arpeggio over the top of an A7 chord. And what this is doing is outlining the sound of an A7 flat 9 chord. You can hear there's a lot of tension inside that chord, and it really wants to resolve to our 4 chord. Now Robben prefers to use a slight variation on this one, which is this shape. This is an A13 flat 9 chord. You can see it's kind of like a mirror image of that diminished 7th chord, but we've just got this triangle shape on the top, and then we just put the thumb on that bottom string. Now this takes us to the scale itself, which is a half-whole diminished scale, because it's made up of a series of half steps and whole steps. Now starting on A, we can do this on one string just to visualize the pattern. It goes like so. Half step, whole step, half step, and so on. Now you're probably familiar with the idea of moving diminished 7th chords around in minor third intervals. And that's because the diminished 7th chord itself is built from a series of minor third intervals. Minor third, minor third, minor third, and so on. And we can start to build some ideas using this concept. This is a great starting lick to help you visualize the landing note. The most important lesson here is that we've got an exit strategy. So this is all about targeting chord tones in the chord that we're moving to. In this case, because we're going from an A7 to a D7, we're looking for some of those notes from within the D7, so the root, the third, the fifth, or the flat and seventh. In this case, as we travel through the lick, we're targeting that F sharp, which is the major third of our D7 chord. You can see it inside of that chord. Now, not only is this lick in minor thirds, but of course we can also transpose this up and down in minor third intervals. So if we take this lick down a minor third into second position, we've got a different landing note there. Here we're looking for the D, which is the root of our D7. We can do the same thing as well if we go up a minor third. Here we're targeting the fifth of D7. Another way to visualize and get new concepts under the fingers is to build them into familiar ideas. So the next lick is based on a Clapton A7 idea. We can see we're in and around that A7 chord there. Now we can take that idea and move it up and down in 3-fret intervals. And by doing this, we're actually picking up on all of those notes from the diminished scale. Now the reason this works is because inside of this lick we've got our half-whole diminished scale. Now as you can see, just like the first lick, we can transpose this up and down in minor third intervals. This adds a huge amount of value to anything that we learn, because any lick that's based around that diminished scale can be played in 3 other positions. If you're enjoying this video, then don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to keep up to date with my future content. The next part of the 12-bar sequence where we typically see a diminished chord is when we're travelling back from the 4 chord to the 1. So usually somewhere in bar 6. All we do is take our D7, that's our 4 chord, raise the root note up 1 semitone, and we've got an E flat diminished 7th chord. This is known as the gospel lift because it's used in a lot of gospel chord progressions, and it resolves really beautifully back to that A7 chord. So this obviously signposts the potential use of diminished 7th arpeggios and the half-whole diminished scale. Now this can be quite confusing because all of our shapes sit 1 fret below where we were for our A7 chord. Over the A7 chord we were here. Now this can be quite difficult to visualize, but one thing you can do is relate it to the blues scale. So if we take our A minor blues scale, you can see that we've got quite a lot of common notes with our diminished 7th arpeggio. We've got our root note, we've got our minor third, we've got the flattened 5th. The only one that's different in there is the major 6th. Here's a lick that takes us all the way through from bars 3 to 6 of our 12-bar blues. So this is as we're transitioning from the 1 to the 4 chord and then back to the 1 again. So this uses a combination of the A half-whole diminished scale for the A7, and D half-whole diminished for our D7 chord. Now this can be quite hard to visualize because, as I mentioned before, these two scales and arpeggios are only 1 semitone apart from each other, so it's quite easy to get muddled up between the two. Now one thing that Robben does quite a lot is to use a dominant 7th arpeggio as a springboard to get him into using the diminished. So here we start out with the root, 3rd, 5th and flat 7, but instead of going to the root again, we jump to the flat 9. And that'll get us into our diminished 7th arpeggio. I'd highly recommend cycling around chords 1 to 4, as this can really help you feel and hear those changes. I've left a link down below to a backing track that does just this. So the final place where we can potentially play some diminished ideas is in the last bar of the 12-bar sequence. So this is as we turn around from the 5 chord back to the start again. This functions in exactly the same way as before. We take our E7 arpeggio, we raise the root note 1 semitone, and we've got our diminished 7 substitution. And we should be able to see that half-whole diminished scale in there too. Now an interesting side note to this is the minor third relationship to the chords that we're using as well. So if we take that dominant 13 flat 9 chord that we looked at earlier on, so here we're playing an E13 flat 9 chord, we can actually move this chord around in minor third intervals as well. Now when we get down here, we're in familiar Hendrix territory because we're playing an E7 sharp 9 chord. Now this is yet another diminished signpost for Robben. Now he'll often integrate some of these chord shapes into his soloing just to create a little bit of tension. Hopefully this video has given you some nice outside ideas to try out over a blues. Remember, the key here is really understanding the harmony and nailing that landing note rather than the licks themselves. So make them your own, play around with the timing and the phrasing, and definitely transpose them into different keys. I'll see you next time.